We are all imperiled by the climate emergency, but some of us are clearly more threatened than others. Human and non-human animals and entire ecosystems are under duress. It's hard to know exactly where to place the emphasis in sketching the contours of an ongoing struggle for revolutions in energy use that could prevent the devastation of runaway global heating, but acknowledging that the impact is extremely uneven might be the most imperative. Because there's an urgent need for us to reject the reigning energy regime of fossil fuel extraction, a group of authors and academics recently got together to imagine pathways out of our current impasse. The outcome of that meeting was this 6-episode podcast series. In this installment of Volatile Trajectories, you'll hear from Allan Stoekl, Sarah Marie Wiebe, Casey Williams, and Imre Szeman about the political structures that constrain the collective agency required to combat climate change. It's hard to summarize this expansive discussion, but it can maybe be captured best by 3 words: pleasure, solidarity, and sacrifice. Words that contain entire worlds. Allan Stoekl is Professor Emeritus of French and Comparative Literature at Penn State. He's written extensively on 20th and 21st century French and European intellectual history, and more recently on questions of energy use and sustainability. Sarah Marie Wiebe is Assistant Professor in the School of Public Administration at the University of Victoria. Her research focuses on environmental justice, public engagement, and community-engaged research. Drawing upon her lived experience, she is currently writing a manuscript entitled Hot Mess: Becoming a Mother During a Code Red Climate Emergency. Casey Williams recently graduated from Duke University's doctoral literature program. His research looks at how fossil-fueled modes of life and work have shaped political responses to climate change since the 1980s. And finally, Imre Szeman, who moderates this discussion, is director of the Institute for Environment, Conservation, and Sustainability and professor of human geography at the University of Toronto Scarborough. He conducts research in energy humanities, environmental studies, and social and political philosophy. Here they talk about how energy transition might not be as pain-free as petrocapitalists want us to believe, with cleaner oil and carbon capture and storage sort of paving the way to maintain the status quo. That model of top-down climate leadership has clearly failed in many ways, where decisions upstairs, in Allan's words, are thought to magically lead to far-reaching positive effects on the sovereign decisions of people on the ground. In the face of that established neoliberal model, they try to think through what will be required to build mass support for energy transition at multiple scales.
So we've been reflecting a little bit about the current moment we're in, defined more than anything, I think, by the climate crisis and the necessity for energy transition. And one of the first questions we've been thinking about is how to produce mass support for a transition away from fossil fuels, which we understand to be a transition not just away from specific energy sources, but towards a whole different set of social relations and ways of organizing ourselves in society. And we've been thinking about how to build that support across different scales. So oftentimes, energy transition is conceived in terms of individual choices about consumption, behavior, etc. But we also want to think about what it means to build support for large-scale social transformations at other scales: city, state, federal, global. So breaking that kind of dependency, which is also a dependency on class relations, having to work for a wage, having to buy commodities, is one of the essential steps, we think, towards actually building support for really large-scale social changes.
Appreciate your emphasis on thinking about everyday lives. We've been reflecting a lot on how sometimes these transitions can feel really abstract and really far away from our own kind of habits and practices, and want to take some time to think together collectively about how our individual choices or behaviors are sort of one scale and connected to larger systems. So we were speaking earlier today about public transit and infrastructure and biking, and we can make these individual choices, but they're also contingent on, you know, policy making, just infrastructure, larger systems of capital. And so just a reminder that, you know, we have to put this kind of in context and think through these relations at multiple sites and scales. And I know that, Allan, you've been thinking a lot about sovereignty in relation to these questions, so I'm kind of curious to hear how you would situate some of these reflections in relation to kind of, you know, the everyday habits and sovereignty, and why you want to bring sovereignty into the conversation.
Yeah. This is a strange moment historically, I think, because we are coming up against we're in a time when these crucial transformations are being sketched out and put in practice, both on what we might call the micro level, that is, on the part of individuals, their wants and needs. But there's the larger question of public policy. And in recent, we could mention the fact that there's an election coming up in the U.S., the congressional election, in a couple weeks. And a lot of the push and pull will have to do with recent legislation in the U.S. having to do with funding green infrastructure. And of course, the Republicans are arguing against a lot of that sort of thing. So we see at the highest level governmental policy, the need for governmental policy, the opposition to governmental policy. And to a certain extent, these changes, we would like to imagine them as being completely pain-free. In other words, one day you flip on your light and the electricity is coming from a solar panel rather than from a coal-fired boiler system. But many of the transitions will involve individual actions on the part of voters, changes in their daily lives, and obviously also in their financial well-being. So there's a kind of movement back and forth, I guess you could say. There's the moment of sovereign decision, which is somebody makes a decision somewhere to change things. Like we were talking about bike infrastructure in New York City. This is something that's going to radically decrease, it could in principle radically decrease the amount of fossil fuel burned in the city. More people getting around on bikes, fewer cars making the air unbreathable and so on. But we know that without bike infrastructure, that kind of change doesn't happen. So there has to be a decision, so to speak, upstairs, and seemingly sometimes a kind of unqualified decision. In other words, it's simply a decision made by somebody to change something. And we know, for example, in New York, there was this person involved in traffic planning and urban structure, Jeanette Sevikan, working with Mayor Bloomberg. She would simply make the decisions. Okay, we're going to go with this. We'll close Times Square and we'll put tables where cars used to go. Not very democratic. And of course, there was a hue and cry. People learned to live with it. But now that's one example of change. And then on the other end, along with that, there has to be a lot of personal decision. And of course, a lot of people aren't going to say to themselves, well, I'm going to walk or ride my bike because I'm creating less pollution or because we're using too much oil. But they will make the decision because they think I can get around a little quicker this way. And especially since the COVID, I can avoid going in the subway and so on. So these are all, affecting the change then. It's very difficult because one has to think on sort of the macro level in which there's a kind of sovereign decision-making, which might appear very undemocratic, and then the individual level. But meanwhile, of course, this is a democracy, at least in rough outline. It's sort of a democracy. People are voting.
I want to pick up on a few things you said, Allan, if I can. The first is this idea that the transition could or should be pain-free. It's an interesting question, and I think it's easy to imagine that the energy transition could or should look like preserving the total infrastructure of contemporary life with cleaner energy inputs. So when you switch on the light, it's the same, everything is the same except it's coming from wind or something, or solar. But I think this is an open question, really. And, there are two considerations, it seems to me. The first is recognizing that there are many features of contemporary social life that are stultifying for people, that people do not want, and that ought to change. And for me, part of building a constituency for an expansive conception of the energy transition is identifying these aspects of, we call it fossil fuel modernity or fossil fuel capitalism or whatever, that people have a kind of immediate knee-jerk reaction against, and which might allow them to imagine benefiting from some other kind of way of relating to the world. And you mentioned transit, and this is one example, I think, where driving a car is something that people do for pleasure, yes, but it's also something people do because they have to. In the US, at least, urban infrastructure is spatially dispersed. People live far away from their jobs, especially as gentrification displaces people into the exurbs. And so they're dependent on a car. It's not that they love the car, but they have to use it. And so using this kind of latent interest in some other way of getting around, some other way of relating to the city, is a way maybe to build support for mass transit infrastructure that is free, so we can take transit off of the market. We can make it no longer a commodity, but something that people are able to use just because they live in a city. Using people's immediate material interest to help build a conception of what the world could look like that would be better for most people, that doesn't use fossil fuels or its kind of patterns of spatial and social organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in the case of what we've been talking about, if we think back on the history of fossil fuel use in the United States, it's not as if at some point everyone marched in the street and said, we want cars. No doubt some people were happy, like when Henry Ford came out with the Model T. If you lived on a farm, it really did make life easier. However, if you lived in the city, you probably didn't have much use for it. And you were used to crossing the street at any point in the block. Your kids ran out and played in the street. It was just part of your life. Wagons would come and go pulled by horses. At a certain point, somebody had to make that decision. We're going to clean up the streets. We're going to get the people off the streets. We're going to put the cars through. And I remember when I was quite young, we were driving down a street, and my father said, they're going to put a freeway in here. 1980. This was maybe 1962 or something. They've got this thing planned for 1980. And indeed, by 1980, there was the I-95 running up through Milwaukee, cut a huge swath through it, displaced I don't know how many people. Of course, it went through the neighborhoods that couldn't really resist. But that was a very strong top-down decision-making. And of course, it encouraged the expansion of the city and further car dependency. So those things were going hand in hand. So there is that moment of decisive action that has to be taken. However, it can obviously also be taken as a moment of tyrannical imposition of will. So this is where the bottom-up side comes in. People have to be able to imagine things in their interest that will lead to some more, let's just use the term, sustainable form of life. And I guess there is a role of education involved in all that. I don't know, I'll leave it at that.
Sarah, I'd be curious to know what you think about this tension between sovereign action happening in a kind of decisive, maybe even authoritarian way, versus sovereign action as a more democratic process, which I think is probably slower. And to frame that question, I guess I'll say that one thing that has concerned me about the urgency or emergency discourse around climate change is that it does seem to give license to actions that can be done really, really quickly, or it seems to encourage actions that can be done really, really quickly, and decisively. And I think this encourages two related responses. One is this kind of authoritarian response, where actors with a lot of social power already are able to say, well, we need to do something now, so we're going to do it my way. And that looks like Elon Musk, flooding the market with Teslas. Or it looks like authoritarian regimes saying, look, climate change is producing a lot of migration. It's going to really mess things up in our nation, so we need to close the borders. And that's climate action. And then on the individual level, the desire to do something immediately also produces these kinds of knee-jerk, kind of not efficacious consumer reactions where we're like, I need to do something, so I'll change my light bulbs or whatever. And it doesn't kind of extend beyond that. But I'm curious what you think about this tension between decisive action and kind of maybe more democratic but maybe slower action.
Yeah, I think that kind of attention to time is significant here, and I've been reflecting a fair bit lately on state of emergency declarations and kind of generally speaking, but also in relation to the climate emergency and extreme weather events. And when speaking recently about this, someone in the audience said to me, during a state of emergency, I don't want greater democracy. I don't want more public engagement. I don't want more deliberation. I want swift action. I want someone to take charge. My answer to that is probably that we need more opportunities for meaningful deliberation before times of emergency, but the problem is we're in an emergency, we're in a slow emergency. So I think we need to cultivate more spaces of kind of meaningful deliberation discussion. This podcast is one attempt to do that, actually, to spark some deliberation about how do we kind of come together and envision ways to respond to these challenges that don't always require a sovereign decision, perhaps. So maybe this is a good way to segue into the next question or next sort of theme that we have, which really continues on this discussion here about the role of democracy. And obviously there's different forms of democracy, some more polarized, some more hierarchical, some perhaps more deliberative or collaborative. The question that we came to collectively is, what would democratic resource management look like if we're trying to think beyond oil to some degree, and what kinds of transformations can get members of the public enthusiastic about to perhaps enhance more participatory engagement and control. So I think the danger here is moving towards more participatory engagement and control can be scary if you're looking at a population that is more pro-fossil fuels, for instance. So how do you kind of shift consciousness, I think, is underlying this question. How do we get people to care about these futures beyond oil? My personal take here is that we need more meaningful spaces of discussion. So classrooms, podcasts, spaces where people feel safe, sharing their perspectives, having meaningful exchanges. And I think part of the problem with a lot of really formal, institutionalized processes around, let's say, resource management, like oil pipeline expansion, for instance, is that they're often very static and tokenistic and performative, but there's limited opportunities for exchange of ideas, because I think in order to work towards some kind of transformation, whether it's personally, societally, or broader, there needs to be some kind of listening, some kind of exchange, and the ability to reflect and say, okay, I was wrong, I've learned something today. So I think the problem here is that we need more spaces that kind of feed back into policy making, and for me that's more kind of horizontal. But that might sound very idealistic, so I'm curious to hear what others think about this. How do we engage publics meaningfully in ways that create space for transformation and to shift consciousness?
Maybe one thing that I have often thought about is that the kind of deliberation that you're talking about, or participation in democracy that might be necessary in order to affect meaningful environmental change, of the level that Casey started talking about, social transformation to go with environmental change, is that there's like a bit of a trick of history that this comes right at the moment when the public has disappeared, when we are trying to do environmental change after neoliberalism or in the middle of neoliberalism, when there's a retreat of publics broadly stated, from participating even in existing systems when there has been sovereignty enacted, but by neoliberal governments under the guise of being democratic. So is there a way that environmental change kind of comes at a moment, the necessity of it comes at a moment when the ability to address it most effectively has kind of disappeared? It's almost to say, if we thought of a counter history, what if we started to be worried about climate change at the moment when there was a post-war Keynesian, let's just say Keynesian society? Would there have been other opportunities? Or is there a way now that the top-down emerges because there's that sense of no bottom-up activity? When I listen to this discussion about sovereignty, it reminds me of discussions I've had with environmentalists, kind of on the sly, about how much they admire China, about things China can do because there's no democracy. So they'll cite things to me such as the 2 billion trees that were planted around Beijing in advance of the Olympics, or the current plan to build 150 nuclear reactors in the next decade. Whatever you think about nuclear energy as a solution. In Western Europe, in Canada, in the US, it seems inconceivable to build a single nuclear reactor. And so then there's a dependence on other things. So I guess what I'm asking is there a stuckness about where we're at? Like, how would that change the kinds of discussions you're having?
Well, I keep thinking back to that moment in about 1979, was it? When Jimmy Carter came out, and he was our president at the time. And he was kind of a peak oil guy, avant la lettre. He was a disciple of Hyman Rickover and so on, who was the nuclear energy prophet of the 1950s. So Carter was very keyed in on this stuff, and he said, we have an energy crisis. And this was a point where the Iranians had been boycotting oil, and the price of oil was shooting up. And his famous line was, this is the moral equivalent of war. We have to figure out how to cut our energy use, and we should all get behind it just in the same way that the United States sort of fell into line during World War II.
We must not be selfish or timid if we hope to have a decent world for our children and our grandchildren. We simply must balance our demand for energy with our rapidly shrinking resources. By acting now, we can control our future instead of letting the future control us. The most important thing about these proposals is that the alternative may be a national catastrophe. This difficult effort will be the moral equivalent of war, except that we will be uniting our efforts to build and not to destroy.
And it fell on completely deaf ears. It was just the biggest flop. And within a few years, of course, Reagan was elected, and he tore off the solar panels from the White House. And the message was pretty clear that the people had voted, and they were not interested in the moral equivalent of war. That is the moment of sovereign decision. We will now wean ourselves from fossil fuels. Their immediate interests were more significance to them. The rise in the cost of oil being blamed on.
Right. There is this analogy to war that's often trotted out.
Right.
So that as there was the capacity to mobilize all of society to change what they do, to set aside their personal desires, hopes, that the same kind of activity could be put towards environmental ends, could be put towards climate action. It's been advocated by recent books by liberals saying patriotism is the best thing you can do. Indeed, perhaps one could see this a slightly different way in a text like philosopher Chantal Mouffe's recent book, where she advocates for a way of thinking about a left and all of it, what it can do within a nationalist frame by embracing patriotism. And I wonder how that works in these discussions of sovereignty and how this works in the participation of individuals and the setting aside of desires and so on.
Yeah, I mean, this is, as you said, there have been a couple of recent books on this, and John Kerry's, he's Biden's climate czar. His initiative is called World War Zero, to get us to, no carbon net neutrality by 2050. And there's also this book by this kind of liberal political economist, Anatol Lievin, about civic nationalism as a solution to climate change. And it's precisely this idea that we need to cultivate some kind of national identity that can give people a good reason to make sacrifices on behalf of the planet. And that good reason, Lievin and others think, is patriotism. I'll do it for my nation. To me, this is a very scary thought.
Yeah. He assumes in that book that liberalism is always good.
Exactly.
I think he actually uses that phrase. This works if there's a good liberalism. Luckily, there's a good liberalism.
Precisely. Exactly. And this is the, dare I say it, this is the liberal road to fascism, which is that and this is the problem with nationalist politics always, regardless of how they're invoked or for what reasons, is that they create a unity between a ruling class in a nation, a class whose rule is supported by its material power, its ownership of resources, and a working class, which is a subordinate class, that doesn't have material power because it doesn't own things. And their interests are fundamentally not aligned, and nationalism creates the appearance of alignment. But even in the case of climate change, the interests of the majority of people in the US, of working people in the US, are not the interests on the issue of climate change of the ruling class. And we can imagine different kinds of green energy transitions that benefit different classes. And the current path that green energy transition is taking is one that preserves the material power of the people who currently have it. And even in the Inflation Reduction Act, this is really a boon to green capital, companies like Tesla, that stand to benefit from the tax incentives that are in that deal. But the working class, the majority of people, have a different set of interests, and fundamentally those interests are about greater social power, having more ownership, more concrete material power, and the ability to use that power to determine what social organization looks like. And I think this also gets to Imre's question about political detachment and maybe even cynicism. 60% of the US population will not vote in these midterms. And there's an incredible sense of alienation from the political process by many, many people in the US. And part of that has to do with neoliberalism's fragmentation of social life, but it also has to do with the complete obliteration of working people's sources of real power. I'm thinking here especially of the unions in the labor movement. People withdraw because they know correctly that they don't really have much say over the political process. And so for me, building mass support for a transition that doesn't just benefit the ruling class, but which benefits the majority of people, is about building up these bases of social power from which people can actually intervene in the political process. And, people have a lot of things, good and bad to say about unions. But I think building up the labor movement is maybe an essential task if we hope to have a really just transition.
Sure.
In terms of kind of democracy and feeling disengaged, I'm actually curious. I haven't read Chantal Mouffe's book, Left Populism, so I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about that in a moment. But I think there's this danger of populism. So I feel this stuckness or this tension, like we want to be more inclusive and, have these voices, but then what if those are the voices that I don't want to hear, that are, pro-oil and pro-kind of more Republican conservative values. So how do we be authentically deliberative when there's that danger of, the discourse getting taken over perhaps by these more conservative perspectives? So I feel a little bit of stuckness there, wanting to be more inclusive, but then nervous about what might emerge in, say, these conversations. I'm intrigued by Casey's suggestion about building up different sources of power for people, and considering the labor movement, for instance. But also, maybe this is going in a slightly different direction, but how do we, shift consciousness and cultivate different forms of attachments? And I think, most kind of citizens think of themselves as consumers and have these very individualistic practices and habits. But I keep going back to, maybe this is my kind of critical ecofeminist background coming up, but how do we center care in these relations? How can we get people to care beyond just their own self-interest, care about each other, care about their environments, care about these relationships? And I think being from the West Coast, where there's a lot of discussions with Indigenous communities and Indigenous ontologies, I find myself very drawn to Indigenous ontologies and ways of thinking and being that is very different than kind of consumerism. I know later on we want to talk a bit about how do we move beyond our visions of liberal property ownership and think in different ways. There's this really beautiful paper by Brad Bryan called Properties and Ontology, and I think that really gets at the root of these struggles. I want to advocate for thinking in more caring ways, thinking in more kind of community-oriented ways. I know we need to obviously think about transitions across scales, but I guess if we kind of zoom into the individual for a moment, I'm wondering about how can we get people generally more interested in caring about life beyond themselves. I feel like that's at the root of this. How do we move beyond extraction, just wanting to kind of take from our environments, and how do we want to be in relation to our environments? And that way of thinking might sound simple, but it also is kind of profound at the same time. And I feel like that more relational, kind of human more than human connective becomes a lot of kind of critical ecofeminist scholarship and critical Indigenous scholarship. So I bring that up just because in the heart of my core, I want to be more hopeful about participatory democracy, but I'm nervous about it at the same time, because I'm nervous about what kinds of views will come up and the kind of, if we're engaging in these more kind of conservative, pro-extractive narratives and ideologies, how will that then transform policy? So I feel like we have a really important role to play as educators to try to open up students' minds, to get them thinking differently. I know when I started university, I was a little more conservative in orientation, and through reading and taking political theory and philosophy courses, that influenced my own training and my own trajectory. So maybe that's where I find a little glimmer of hope in all of this, is the role that we play in education and trying to open people's minds a little bit, center care, center these other ways of thinking about life kind of beyond oil, and think about the transition.
If I could just follow up on that, I think that the question of education needs to be focused on. I mean, we were talking about Jimmy Carter and his exhortations to moral equivalent of war. One could argue it fell on deaf ears because people simply were not in a position to receive that message, so to speak. He was playing a different language game, I guess Lyotard, the philosopher, would say, from the game that people had been playing since the end of World War II, when they were told that they were living in an era of prosperity and mass consumption, and they were happy with that, or at least they had become satisfied with it. So on the one hand, you have that kind of exhortation. I do want to speak just for a moment in this context with sacrifice. Carter seemed to be calling for sacrifice. And there is something to be said for, in the context of sovereignty, sacrifice. And as an example, I would just cite what's going on in Europe today, and to a lesser extent maybe in this country. People are being asked to accept the inconveniences of higher prices and perhaps a shortage of fuels for the entirely laudable goal of aiding the Ukrainians. In other words, cutting off their natural gas shipments is a way of aiding the Ukrainian effort by sanctioning Putin. During COVID, we saw something maybe even more extreme. People were asked to sacrifice their personal comfort by putting masks on. Now, I'm not saying that there wasn't a huge resistance to that. And this winter, we're going to see how strong the will to self-sacrifice really is. And especially given the fact that it will be a sort of class phenomenon where people who are less wealthy obviously are going to be much more affected by this than the wealthy. So this is a real problem in any model of solidarity, isn't it? If you're talking about a national solidarity, the nation is composed of many different groups and classes, many of whom have different economic backgrounds. So there is a real problem with the solidarity model, and yet it would seem to be just about all there is. In other words, how would one face Putin and attempt, short of going to war, which would lead to nuclear war, sort of eventually defeating his action in Ukraine, short of a kind of self-sacrifice on the part of the people. Not warfare necessarily, but nevertheless a model of sacrifice. And in that context, I would mention education. And I've been thinking of education all along. The problem with education is, unlike warfare, education is a real longue durée kind of thing. And I discovered that when I was teaching, and this was back when peak oil was on mode, and it's still an important issue. And I was teaching an upper level course at the University of Penn State on supposed international relations, and I had students reading about oil issues in the class, and there was an enormous amount of resistance. I even had some counter arguments to sort of satisfy the real hard-headed ones. I thought we could get some interesting discussions going, and the general tendency was just to discount it all, with some exceptions. Some of the students picked up on it. But I thought after a while, this would work better as a kind of a capstone to education that young people have received all along. So rather than my starting out with their senior year at the university and talking about this stuff, if they have been exposed to these issues for a considerable length of time in high school, even primary school, and there's no reason why a decent education having to do with these energy issues, which are, as we know, intertwined with political questions, environmental questions, questions about consumerism. There's no reason for that not to be taught and to, in the long run, have a real effect on the way the populace thinks. The only problem is it takes a long time. We're not talking about a kind of political event that's going to happen in a few years. There are effects of education that happen in different ways outside of schools, of course. Like, again, thinking of the urban changes made in New York City, which encouraged biking, hanging out in the street, cafes on Times Square. That was a kind of education as well. There was an enormous amount of resistance to it at the beginning, and as people got into it, they came to, maybe not 100%, but more and more people came to accept it. So that's another kind of education. But certainly there's a huge role, I think, for the schools in this, but it's not a quick solution by any means.
Maybe I'll just throw in one thing. I do think it builds a little bit off that. It goes back to your question about what Chantal Mouffe is interested in. I suppose what her project, it's called Towards a Left Populism, is that she recognizes the power of populism to get a constituency, indeed a whole nation, to understand themselves as a body, a single body, to see themselves as perhaps with a project. And we know what right populism's project is. And that's something that I think none of us here would commit to. I can say that especially as a Hungarian. And what I've seen unfolding there in the last decade has been alarming to me. What Mouffe wants to do is take what she sees as the power of right populism and kind of preserve the elements of connection of community, the production of a single project. She sees that that's a model, that something can be done with that. And she describes it this way. She says that what she sees as a left populism is that, and this is in her words, it's built around a patriotic identification with the best and more egalitarian aspects of national tradition. So unlike what I think would be a position that the left would normally take, that is anti-nationalist, cosmopolitan, certainly not patriotic. That seems to be something we're not committed to, though perhaps it's coming back in these issues like Green New Deal as a project, as a way of dealing with things. She doesn't want to dismiss the patriotic and the national, and what she wants to insert, this is the tricky bit of this quote. She says, it's the patriotic, but about the best parts. And that's incredibly tricky. I don't know if there's a model of that.
That's a very traditional French way of looking at the Republic.
That could be.
How do we think of fidelity and commitment to the Republic, which is a democratic republic, as a kind of self-sacrifice toward a higher goal, which would actually replace religion? So there's almost a religion of the Republic. I'm sure she doesn't go in that direction.
It's come up in other texts. There's a book by Kai Bosworth called Pipeline Populism, and he sees that same populism at work in some of the counter-pipeline actions, including those by indigenous communities in South Dakota. It's a complicated argument, and I won't introduce that here.
Well, I was just thinking that one of the kind of directions we want to go in as we kind of move toward the conclusion of our podcast is around thinking of questions of connection, joy, pleasure. I know this came up a little bit for Allan. To link it to what we were just talking about, is there some, whether it's populism or a different kind of social, political organizing, what kinds of maybe pro-social behavior or collective action would help us kind of come together to move into this transition that is joyful, that is beautiful, that is hopeful, and can kind of get us thinking, moving beyond oil, beyond extraction. Where would each of you kind of turn to kind of get us in that direction?
If I could linger with the dangers for a moment and then come to the more utopian possibilities. The question of nationalism and populism, I think it's important to distinguish between different kinds of sacrifice, or sacrifice in the service of different kinds of goals. And I think, Allan, this is something you gestured at as well. There's a difference between just an ordinary person in the U.S. being asked to give up some of what little they have in the name of an energy transition that stands to benefit people who are not that person and who in fact have very different interests from that person and everyone they know. There's a difference between that kind of sacrifice and the kinds of sacrifices that we make where we're truly in solidarity with people. The distinction has to do with the degree to which we have ownership over determining what the goals of our actions are. So if we're all, and this is a question of democracy and sovereignty as well, if we're all together determining what the goals are, and we feel like we're genuinely participating in that project, then making sacrifices for the sake of solidarity, making sure that other people can also achieve their wants and needs, is a extremely laudable ethic, I think. The problem is, I see, that this ethic is invoked to justify projects that actually only benefit a particular group. And this to me is the problem, even with the most ideal visions of civic nationalism. Because that unity, that cross-class unity, is fictitious unless you have a socialist or communist state, or international community. And I think, Sarah, this gets to your discussions about care too, because I think care is a place where it's another extremely laudable ethic that people have and want to express and perform. But it often gets used to manipulate people. Right? People want to care for each other, but they're exploited, basically. And that interest in doing things for others is actually used to demand some kind of sacrifice from them that doesn't really benefit them at the end of the day. How do you preserve an ethic of care, a politics of care, that is truly solidaristic and not, and that hedges against that kind of exploitation?
Good question. How do we move towards a politics of care that's not extractive? I think there's that danger there that, care can be kind of manipulative. So what does authentic care look like? I think that's kind of at the heart of your question. Yeah, and that's again where I keep wanting to go back to education. I feel like it's really important to explain to students and others, our listeners and other kind of engaged publics about what meaningful, non-exploitive care would look like. And there's this really simple book that I've taught with in the classroom for undergrad courses that are kind of like service learning type classes or experiential learning classes called Gardens of Democracy. It's very simple, it's super entry level, but the core argument is simple. It's like, we're all better off when we're all better off. Basically just saying that, we need to challenge our kind of individualism with this more kind of collective ethic. So I don't know if I have a very concrete answer yet to what that care looks like, but I think there's little glimpses in sort of teaching. In the classes that I teach, sometimes we do kind of outdoor learning, and actually this came to light for me a lot in Hawaii. I really benefited and was fortunate to live and work there for 3 years, and it was very common to do kind of aina-based learning, so learning that was kind of in relation to land and the environment, and many of my Native Hawaiian colleagues would take us and take students in these groups and trips to learn from community organizers who are trying to revitalize local food systems, and embedded with that education and food is also language and culture. And so care has a really different meaning there. It's care for each other, care for the land, care for the food. For those who don't know, a lot of Hawaiian food is imported, for instance, and not a lot of it is grown locally. So I think these care ethics can come in through how we teach, through how we learn from and in relation to others. So, in my positionality there, I was a foreigner, a white foreigner coming in, learning from my colleagues, from community leaders about how to literally cultivate better alternative kind of ecological relations that were less kind of manipulative or exploitative or extractive. So for me, I guess it comes back again to education and learning. And as much as I'm interested in kind of discourse and deliberation, I think we also need to attend to these kind of quiet, humble spaces of listening and witnessing and kind of observing too. I think there's actually a lot of interesting work happening in Hawaii. I know during the pandemic there was a group that came together kind of under the framing of Aloha Aina Futures, meaning kind of how do we cultivate these caring values beyond our current extractive models, kind of beyond the American exploitation model. And there's a playbook, Aloha Aina Economic Futures Playbook, which I would recommend, and maybe you can go in the show notes, because there's a really sort of richly fleshed out policy playbook for bringing care into these economic relations. And the care involves better health care, better parental leave, better societal benefits that are more distributed. So I do find myself often turning to Hawaii as an interesting place where these conversations are happening. So mindful of the dangers, wanting to gesture to the utopias without being naive at the same time. I mean, Hawaii is a very complicated place, so I turn there with caution.
I guess to get slowly around to the third issue, and one thing that we might think about in relation to education is the question of alienation. I think this is significant in relation to energy use and the use of resources and commodities. Capitalism works through, in the largest sense, creating a consumer culture in which people essentially compete with each other to feel solidarity. In other words, I'm better off when I'm part of the group, but I have a sense of distinction from the group. Right? I'm very much concerned with being, in some sense, inferior to the group, and I would demonstrate my adequacy or even my superiority by distinguishing myself through what I consume. And much of our culture, it's a cliche, but I think it's true, it's a consumer culture, but that means consumption of resources. It doesn't just mean buying a lot of stuff and then putting it in your attic. It means using resources with oil as the very first commodity, the first among equals there, I guess. If one is going to address the issues of oil usage, one really needs to start rethinking capitalism and rethinking the kind of pleasure that's offered by capitalism. That's where we return. If the supreme pleasure is buying stuff and then throwing it away, clearly the current regime of fossil fuel use will continue indefinitely up to some point of crisis. And the infinite growth of consumption is part and parcel of the movement of capitalism as we know it. So the largest issue is certainly social inequality. I would be the first to agree with that. But along with social inequality is, and maybe this is part of the same sort of phenomenon, is this desire for self-distinction via goods that are bought and disposed of. Then that leads to another question, of course, which is how do we think about pleasure in an economy that is not predicated on capitalism? There perhaps we return to the question of care, or there are other modes of consumption that might not be simply buying things to distinguish myself, but some kind of consumption in solidarity. I don't know what that would be. This is where we get into utopianism, I suppose. But if you aren't a utopian, then I don't think you're ever going to get anywhere thinking about this stuff. And so there needs to be, along with thinking about capitalism and alternatives to capitalism, alternatives, I think, to consumerism and elimination in consumerism.
I'll just say I think it's important to distinguish between compensatory pleasures and genuine pleasures. Maybe this is something that you're doing. I see the kinds of pleasures offered by consumer society to compensate for the kinds of social alienation you're describing. And they compensate also for the basic unfreedom of the class system, which is that most of us are not free because we depend on someone else for our livelihood. And so consumerism is a way to create the simulation of freedom in a context of unfreedom. And so I think the challenge really is the one that you're describing, which is how do you rebuild authentic social connections and forms of authentic, social power that allow people to be really free and then also kind of self-determine the things that please them. The kinds of things that people say are most important to them are never consuming things.
Right.
It's always family,
right,
friends, caring for people, making the kinds of sacrifices actually that, bond you to some kind of community. And so having that as a horizon, and it doesn't have to be an energy intensive horizon either. This is not the other thing. Yeah. It's important to acknowledge where modern technology does give us real benefits. Labor saving, I think, is a real benefit in many cases, but also to affirm the kinds of pleasure and freedom that have nothing to do with consuming things.
Yeah, I really appreciate this kind of concluding moment to chat a little bit more about care and solidarity. And there's one word that you mentioned, Allan, which is prosperity. And I want to kind of conclude with that. There's this really great book that I'll recommend to everyone about indigenomics by Carol Ann Hilton. And in this book, she articulates an indigenous approach to economic systems. And she spends a good part of the book talking about the legacy of colonialism and the impact it's had on indigenous economies. But then the most exciting part of the book is that she builds up an argument for revisiting capitalism, challenging capitalism through an indigenous economic prosperity lens. And one of the examples that she discusses, and she's a New Chalmers woman, is the potlatch system, which is based on gift reciprocity and a culture of abundance. So rather than this notion of capitalist accumulation, it's about the distribution of wealth. And I do think it's a very beautiful way of thinking about connection and community And it kind of goes back to that point of you're better off when we're all better off. So you're better off as an individual when you're kind of collectively better off. And there's many communities, Indigenous communities along the west coast of Canada, for instance, that do have revitalized the potlatch system, and a lot of that involves preparing for months about how to feed your neighbors, feed neighboring nations and communities, and provide gifts, jewelry, hand carving, wood carving, sculptures, or whatever the gift might be. And so I think that's a real expression of prosperity, but through this kind of gifting and this caring, culturally grounded way. So I think you both, Casey and Allan, talked about, kind of care at the horizon, and along with kind of thinking about care at the horizon for us moving beyond oil towards these alternative energy futures, I also think about this kind of caring, sharing, loving ethic, and simply, rather than us as a society looking at our environment as sort of land to extract from and use and commodify, I do find myself turning to Indigenous scholars and thinkers who remind us that these are our relatives, these are our relations. So it's a profoundly different way of thinking about the environment. When we think the stone is a grandfather, is a relative, it is a completely different way than thinking of it as something to kind of like manufacture and refine. And so these ontological questions are at the heart of how we look to and live with and relate to our environment. So caring, sharing, and this kind of more kinship relational approach, I think, are exciting ways to kind of move beyond and think beyond this kind of culture of extraction that is all around us.